Welcome everyone. I think we're just going to go ahead and get started right now. This is a fully active webinar brought to you by Monroe County Bar Center for Education. Today is February 3rd, 2021, and this is Racial Disparities in Healthcare, History, Cause and Effects, and Solutions, hosted by the Lawyers Coalition for Racial and Social Justice. We are blessed to have a wonderful panel with us tonight that's going to touch on the historical aspects of racial disparities in healthcare, the local aspect of that disparity, and the relationship between education, housing, employment, and their impact on healthcare, as well as personal observations regarding this topic. To comply with accreditation regulations, please fill out your affirmation form and evaluation sheet at the end of the program and email back to Danielle Madahas. In exchange, you will receive a certificate of attendance after the program via email. Please note that all attorneys must attend the program in their entirety to receive credit. According to the New York State Continuing Legal Education Board, CLE providers are prohibited from issuing partial credit. You'll hear me during the program state the codes for you to notate. Please note that everyone's line has been muted for presentation portion of the session. If you have questions for the panelists during the program, please submit it using the Q&A feature. You may also send questions to fellow audience members or to the host for technical difficulties while using the chat option. Our first speaker is Wade Norwood, who's the CEO of Common Ground Health in Rochester, New York. Wade.
Thank you very much, Duwaine, for that introduction, and welcome all. I am Wade Norwood, CEO of Common Ground Health, and I am delighted to be here tonight. And I thank both the Bar Association and the Lawyers Coalition for assembling what is a fantastic panel of presenters. So I'm going to share my part with you and get out of the way of the geniuses who will co-present with me. Thank you very much for bringing my slides up. If I may, I'd like to, as the slides get centered in, start by talking about COVID-19. Next slide, please. And contextualize it in what Action for a Better Community called last month the three pandemics from which we are suffering. The economic disruption created by COVID has had a disproportionate impact on our community, borne mostly by those in the lower wage jobs. There's also been the pandemic of the persistence of racial oppression and the rightful call for reckoning with our history that has played out in events that ripple even today. And then the most obvious, the pandemic of the public health emergency. Next slide, please. And as you can see by these data presentations, the impacts of the coronavirus by race and ethnicity in terms of hospitalization and in terms of death have been borne disproportionately by our local Black and Latino communities. And as someone who just had to finish burying another congregant due to COVID and its complications. Next slide, please. I am offering as the takeaway for my remarks, the observation of Dr. Fauci back last spring at the beginning of this global pandemic and its impact in America, that what we are discovering and how we are reacting to these three pandemics is really just the recognition of things that we in the field of health and health improvement have always known. And so I am delighted that you all, as representatives of our legal community, are not only taking an interest, but becoming even more robustly engaged in this space. Next slide, please. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, I will spare you 1,000 words from me and show some of my favorite pictures. This is a map, as you can recognize, of the Finger Lakes region by zip code: Lake Ontario to the north, Pennsylvania state border to the south. And this map is color coded so as to reflect by zip code socioeconomic status. SES is a composite measure that we calculate at Common Ground Health, and it reflects the average income of folks who live in the zip code, the poverty rate of the people who live in each zip code's household composition, the unemployment rate of adults in the zip code, the type of occupation held by those adults that work, and the educational attainment of those aged 25 or older. The darker the color, the worse off the people in each zip code fare by those composite measures. The lighter the color, the better off they are. So roughly speaking, the darker the color, the more impoverished the zip code, the lighter color, the wealthier the zip code. And I hope if we had time, I'd be engaging you all in a bi-directional conversation. So I'll just say, I hope that you recognize the city of Rochester as that very dark colored cross shape in the upper left. And I hope that you are struck by how the poverty in the city of Rochester does not stand alone in the Finger Lakes region. In fact, I hope that your takeaway includes the fact that as we look across the region, poverty is the defining characteristic of those who live in the Finger Lakes. Because one of the myths that we need to dispel is the belief that the face of poverty looks like my face in the Finger Lakes, where the truth is, it looks like all of us. And I hope that you also see that very pronounced pocket of wealth in the eastern suburbs of Monroe County. Next slide, please. And I hope, since a picture can do the work of 1,000 words, that by bringing up the same map, color-coded this time by years of potential life loss, by premature mortality, by the rate at which people die earlier than age 75, I hope it becomes clear to you that poverty is literally killing us in the Finger Lakes. Next slide. This is another of my favorite cartoons. It is an expression of what has come to be known as Dr. Mcginnis's theory of the social determinants of health. And the social determinants of health puts forth the data that allows us to document that most of that premature death that we just saw on the map is not due to connectivity with the healthcare system or DNA, but rather as a result of socioeconomics, the environment, both the physical, the built as social and cultural environment, and the behaviors of individuals. And individual choices, as I just said on a call I just got off of, not always are they reflections of the choices that people make. Next slide, please. They're often reflections of the choices that people have. I only have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to go quickly through. This is the data that is our stock and trade. For 40 years at Common Ground Health, we have been the region's source for data about the health of our community. It's all up on our website, commongroundhealth.org, and it is in real easy to access format. You can go and look and comb through data to your heart's delight. But we've been very interested in trying to move beyond the data that says what's going on to understanding why are we seeing what we're seeing. Next slide. So in the summer of 2018, we administered a region-wide survey in which we collected 6,855 completed interviews with folks who live in the Finger Lakes region. We oversampled by race, by age, by income, and by geography, so that with confidence at the 95% confidence interval, we can cross-tab to a fare thee well and still have validity. Next slide. Go up to our website. It's great data to see, but I will tell you my takeaway is what the people who live in the Finger Lakes had to tell us about mental and emotional health. And because we had qualitative responses, we really got to understand that people were talking about helplessness, anger, and self-destructive behavior. Animate this slide. When we look regionally, 90% of adults who live in the Finger Lakes region told us that their health was good, very good, or excellent. And that sounds good until you start peeling the onion. And when we isolate and just look at those adults who live in households with incomes less than $25,000 a year, who tell us whether they're urban, rural, or suburban, that their neighborhood is unsafe, and who tell us that they face transportation barriers as a part of making it through the day, peeling that onion makes you want to cry, makes you want to holler, because 10% becomes 54%. Because folks in poverty are overloaded. Next slide, please. And so we in the world of health improvement have really been understanding that when it comes to that health pathway, we need to move our attention from the acute downstream and really start focusing on the upstream factors of living conditions, of the structural and social inequities that really result from the way in which our systems are built and the rules by which they operate. If we're going to take health improvement further, faster, the answer is really going to be to move outside of the four walls of the hospital or the clinic and start working in the neighborhoods where people live, work, play, and pray. Next slide, please. And that's why I'm delighted that we are here to have this conversation with you all. This is Tom Frieden's pyramid, which has really been the predominant paradigm over the course of the last decade. That what we're really going to need to do is start addressing the very underlying socioeconomic factors that really are shaping the determinants of health. And that means that we're going to have to start thinking about public policy, thinking about the rule of law, and how it is that we can really understand that the most basic work, as Dr. King said, that we have to address is justice. And of all forms of injustice, the most inhumane is health inequity. Thank you very much. I'll be delighted to answer questions when we get to the end of the panel presentations.
Thank you, Wade. Very intriguing presentation, and as far as peeling back the layers, so to speak. Our next speaker is Dr. Daryl Dykes, who is the Chief Diversity Officer and Assistant Professor of Public Health and Preventative Medicine at Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse, New York.
Thank you so much, Wade. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm happy to build on that now as I will share my screen with you and talk about the racial disparities and the historical framework of health disparities from a medical and legal perspective. You should be able to see my screen now. Is that true? Okay, great. Again, so I'm an orthopedic surgeon and scientist at Upstate Medical University, also trained in law, and work here as our Chief Diversity Officer and clinician, actually treating and seeing patients. I'm going to talk to you about this historical framework and look at it over the course of a 500-year history. And if you think about health disparities and the practical, legal, and regulatory issues related to health disparities, you really do have to look at this entire history. Now, of course, I cannot summarize the entire 500-year history of health disparities into the 10 or 12 minutes that I'm allotted here today, but I will try to highlight some of the important factors. The bottom line, if there's one takeaway, health disparities are about racism. It's that simple. And when we talk about racism, of course, in this context, we're talking about systemic or structural or institutional racism. Now, this definition and distinction is a conversation in and of itself, but what we're talking about essentially is that type of racism that is baked into the system as a result of public policy and laws that ultimately affect this outcome, in this case, health disparities. What we're not going to address in these few minutes are details of international law, tort law, state law, or details of the Affordable Care Act or subsequent challenges to the Affordable Care Act, which many of us are aware of. So to think about this, we really have to go back to the turn of last century. And around that time, this individual was a very important figure. Frederick Hoffman wrote a very widely received treatise called Race, Traits, and Tendencies of the American Negro in 1896. Hoffman was a statistician who worked for the Prudential companies and quoted in this piece that it is not the conditions of life, but in the race, traits, and tendencies that we find the excessive causes of Negro mortality. This theory that Hoffman promulgated was largely flawed for a number of reasons. But when we look back historically, one of the main reasons for this is that this position helped justify the increased premiums that insurance companies were charging African Americans for life insurance. It was around that same time when W.E.B. Du Bois actually published The Health and Physique of the Negro American in 1906. And Du Bois concluded from his work that if the population were divided as to social and economic condition, the matter of race would be almost entirely eliminated. So again, the social determinants of health that Wade so astutely introduced in the last sessions. These were things about sanitary conditions, education, economic opportunities that drove the disproportionate death and disease in Black communities. Du Bois recognized this over 100 years ago, and we're still talking about this as a novel concept today. Frederick Hoffman's theories persisted for about 3 decades and dominated all thought related to health disparities with respect to African Americans. And it was over this period of time that a group of people, most notably Booker T. Washington, actually recognized that social determinants of health were the main issues that we were dealing with. And through very insightful work, established annual clinics, national health improvement weeks, Negro health movements, et cetera, that were focused largely on treating these social conditions of health, including sanitary conditions, availability of food, exercise, and the like. Again, this is an effort that existed over 100 years ago, but for some reason seemed novel to us today. It wasn't until 1932 that the United States government had its entree into this issue of health disparities with the organization of the Office of Negro Health Work under the United States Public Health Service. This was formed in 1932, did not have any legislative or regulatory authority. It was mostly educational in nature and was designed to put forth some of the theories that were understood by Booker Washington and others over the prior decade. However, as you know, between 1930 and 1945, the United States was occupied with a couple of other major priorities, including the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and also World War II. So during this time, there was really very little that was discussed, or very little that happened with respect to health disparities, even though we knew they existed. Shortly after the war ended, about a year after the war, this Hill-Burton Act became very important in with respect to this topic. So the Hill-Burton Act, also known as the Hospital Survey and Construction Act of 1946, recognized a disparity or lack of hospital beds, primarily in the rural South, and this provided grants to hospitals to grow and modernize after the war. This again was primarily in the rural South, and the basis of this, and basically to summarize the act, the United States government gave money to hospitals to expand and modernize in return for a reasonable volume of free or reduced free care for 20 years to all people living in the area, and quote, without discrimination on account of race, creed, or color. This bill was making its way through the legislative process, and just before passage, Senator Lister Hill, a Democrat from Alabama, was able to sneak in an amendment. And this amendment read, but an exception shall be made in cases where separate hospital facilities are provided for separate population groups if the plan makes equitable provision on the basis of need for facilities and services of like quality for each such group. So we all know what this is, and we can recognize it as healthcare Jim Crow. This was healthcare that was separate but equal. So during the over 20 years that the Hill-Burton Act distributed funds from 1946 to 1962, there was a total of almost $37 million in total grants awarded to 89 medical facilities. And they certainly were able to achieve their goal of separate, but when we look at equal, there's much was left to be desired. Out of the $36 million that was granted over the 20-year period, only $4 million were allocated to facilities for Blacks, representing 13 medical facilities out of the total 89 that received awards. So you can see in these pie charts that there was a systemic racist distribution of funds and resources to healthcare institutions during this 1946 to 1962 period. Around that time, the civil rights movement, of course, ensued during the 1950s and 1960s. And again, as Wade mentioned earlier, Dr. King is quoted as to say that of all forms of inequity or inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. During the civil rights movement, much of the attention was focused on issues of housing, education, and public accommodations, with very little interest devoted to the disparities in healthcare that were so prevalent in our communities at the time. However, shortly after that, things started to percolate up in the legal arena, and there were a couple of notable lawsuits and cases that deserve mention here today. The first is Simpkins versus Moses H. Cohn Memorial Hospital in the Fourth Circuit in 1963. Simpkins v. Cohn was, again, a Fourth Circuit case in Greensboro, North Carolina, where physicians and dentists sued hospitals for excluding Black providers. In that case, the trial court decided in favor of the hospital. This case was appealed to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which actually reversed the trial court opinion and stated that separate but equal provisions of the Hill-Burton Act were unconstitutional under the equal protection provisions of the 14th Amendment. That was then elevated to the Supreme Court, which denied review, And so the ruling of the Supreme Court stood, and this ban applied to Hill-Burton hospitals, again, in the Fourth Circuit. A second case, Eaton V Grubs, was a 1964 Fourth Circuit case where Black physicians and patients sued a private Wilmington, North Carolina hospital for staff privileges. And in this particular case, the court overturned an earlier decision that the hospital action did not constitute state action. Again, this was a private entity, and any of us who have studied constitutional law or studied for the board, for the bar, will remember Burton v. Wilmington Parking Authority that held that denial of these privileges were unconstitutional because the hospital in this case was performing a state function and was the chosen instrument of the state. So therefore was covered under this act. So when you look at Simpkins and Eaton together, this then applied to Hill-Burton facilities and state affiliated facilities, but it was limited to the Fourth Circuit. And the Fourth Circuit includes North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and West Virginia. So that was shortly followed in 1964 by the Civil Rights Act. And in the Civil Rights Act, particular attention should be paid to Title VI. This was 8 months after Simkins and 3 months after Eaton, which stated no person in the U.S. shall, on the grounds of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So this was the workaround. Now it's dealing with the money. Any organization that was receiving federal funds was now subject to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. However, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the precursor of our current Department of Health and Human Services, excluded enforcement against physicians, Medicare Part B recipients, as contracts of insurance or guarantee. And I won't get too far into this. It gets a little bit complicated, but the takeaway is the Civil Rights Act did apply to hospital facilities, but not to private physicians. Almost 10 years went by before the Public Health Service Act was passed in 1975, and this was notable for a couple of reasons. One thing, it changed the Hill-Burton requirement of a 20-year commitment to state that facilities were required to provide a certain amount of uncompensated services in perpetuity, that facilities may not adopt policies that have a discriminatory effect, and we'll talk more about what that means in a few moments. And it transferred enforcement of this act to the federal government. Ultimately, however, in this act, there was little to no provision for a private right of action for discrimination. And I'll talk more about what that means in a few slides. However, in 1985, another significant event was the Heckler Report. Margaret Heckler was the then Secretary of Health and Human Services and recognized this national paradox of phenomenal scientific achievement and steady improvement in overall health status in the face of persistent, significant health inequities. This is a long time ago. This is not new stuff, again. She established the Secretary's Task Force on Black and Minority Health and established the Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health. The Office of Minority Health and Disparities Research and Education Act followed that in 1998, as well as another law that we are familiar with, HIPAA. The HIPAA provisions related to health disparities relate primarily to the government's collection, storage, and use, as well as disclosure of protected health information, including race, ethnicity, and language data. MDREA, on the other hand, elevated the Office of Mental Health at NIH to a center for minority health. It directed the National Academy of Science to conduct disparities research. It provided for disparities training and education, and instituted a public campaign to end health disparities. During those years, two important figures emerged. One is Dr. Lewis Sullivan. He was the 17th Secretary of Health and Human Services, who is credited with establishing Healthy People 2000. It significantly increased the budget for health disparities research and appointed a number of individuals specifically charged to study and act on health disparities. The second figure is Dr. David Satcher. He was a member of the Center for Disease Control from 1993 to 98, and the 16th Surgeon General of the United States, who is credited with publishing Healthy People 2010, an extension of Dr. Sullivan's work with the overarching goal of eliminating health disparities. Another step along the way was a set of Supreme Court cases. These two that I'll mention here, Alexander versus Cohn and Alexander versus Sandoval. In Cohn, a 1985 case, the court ultimately ruled that a private party may secure equitable relief if he is able to prove intentional discrimination. But it left open this question regarding disparate impact. And we talked about that earlier in the Hill-Burton cases and the previous cases that I mentioned, where disparate impact, so health inequity as a result of structural racism, did not create a private cause of action. Intentional discrimination was the standard according to the Supreme Court in Cohn. And then in Sandoval, went further to say that an individual plaintiff may challenge the policy of a federally funded program only if he can show intentional discrimination. So the challenges for us with respect to health disparities, only a few federally funded, or few, actually, if any, federally funded programs overtly discriminate. Overt discrimination is very difficult to prove. And again, jurisdiction with respect to discrimination in healthcare is limited to the Office of Civil Rights within Health and Human Services to bring these disparate impact actions. Most of the actions that have been brought involve disparate impact towards disabled persons or limited English proficiency, and there has been little to no action regarding health disparities based on race or ethnicity. So then we fast forward to 2002. Unequal treatment is a product of the Institutes of Medicine commissioned by the Congress to look at racial and social inequities and disparities in healthcare. And in that treatise, researchers were able to conclude that there is evidence of racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare, which is, with few exceptions, remarkably consistent across a range of illnesses and healthcare services. And most importantly, these disparities persist despite adjustments for access-related factors, such as a patient's insurance status or income. Fast forward from 2002, there was very little activity in this area between 2002 and 2010 when the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was passed on March 23rd, 2010. Specific provisions of the Affordable Care Act did address health disparities with some general provisions, but then also specific provisions such as the non-discrimination provisions under Section 1557, workforce diversity, reauthorization of Indian health factors, and then also expanded rules for data collection and monitoring. Two more issues before I close. One is this issue of a right to healthcare, and then finally, a few comments about international law. There is no right to healthcare in the United States, bottom line. There might be arguments under equal protection arguments or due process arguments, but in essence, this is not a fundamental right. When we look at the hierarchy of laws, however, in our country, from the United States Constitution down to state laws and statutes, we can see that acts of Congress and international law or treaties are very high in this hierarchy. The United States is related to two treaties that I'll mention here very briefly. The first is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And the second is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The first treaty provides that non-discrimination in access to health facilities, goods, and services to marginalized groups such as ethnic minorities. And it states that all healthcare facilities, goods, and services must be respectful of medical ethics and culturally appropriate, i.e., they must be respectful of the culture of individuals, minorities, peoples, and communities, sensitive to gender and life cycle requirements, as well as being designed to respect confidentiality and improve the health status of those concerned. Well, what's the problem? This treaty was ratified by 164 countries and signed by the United States in 1977, but it has yet to be ratified. CERD, or the Convention on Equal Rights, states that any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of getting back to this issue again of intentional versus unintentional discrimination, of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. It goes on to say that parties to this treaty must undertake to prohibit and to eliminate racial discrimination in all of its forms, and to guarantee the right to everyone, without distinction as to race, color, or national or ethnic origin, to equality before the law, notably in the enjoyment of the right to public health, medical care, Social Security, and social services. Now, with CERD, this was signed by the United States on September 28, 1966, and ratified by the Congress on October 21, 1994. So still a long time ago. So what's the problem here? There's a clause in this convention negotiated by the United States that says nothing in the convention shall be deemed to require or to authorize legislation or other action by the United States of America incompatible with the provisions of the Constitution of the United States of America. So there's basically a clause in this convention that says, yes, we agree to all the terms, but we reserve the right to make our own rules and not comply with the terms, in essence. Further, it says that before any dispute to which it is a party may be submitted to the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice under CERD, the specific consent of the United States is required in each case. So the United States has to consent to being held to the standard to which they signed and ratified. So this, in my last two slides here, is a current view of where we are. This is a law review article that I wrote in 2015, looking at these issues in much, much greater detail. The figure that you see to the right and expanded here is a summary of the health disparities, health equity machine at the legal and regulatory level. And if you look at health disparities here in the center, you can see that, of course, federal law, state law, international law all feed into this. If we look at this federal health equity team, which includes all of the government organizations, housing and urban development, Department of Transportation, Department of Defense, and so on, including the Office of Health and Human Services, are influenced by the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, and then this trickles down through subdivisions of the Department of Health and Human Services, explicitly the Office of Minority Health, and impacts health disparities. But just looking at this, you can see that it's an incredibly complex and overlapping system, and it is riddled with bureaucracy, as you might imagine. So it's not surprising that we're still dealing with some of these issues in 2020 that were recognized by W.B. Du Bois in the early 1900s. And so with that, I will close and look forward to talking to you more and answering any questions during our dialogue.
Thank you, Dr. Dykes. I'm sure we're going to have many, many questions concerning whether or not our actions are actually living up to the rhetoric and our signature on those dotted lines. Next up, we have Shane Wiegand, who's a fourth grade teacher in the Rush Henrietta School District and co-lead of the anti-racist curriculum project at his school. Shane has trained over 900 teachers in anti-racist curriculum across multiple school districts. Shane?
Thank you so much, Duwaine. And Dr. Dykes, I got to say, that was one of the best times I've had in weeks. I loved everything you had to share, and I can't wait to look at those slides again. Thank you so much. I think what you did, it really ties right into what I'm going to talk about, which is a little bit more focused on housing and the way that directly connects to health and equity, and take a closer look at health institutions right here in Monroe County that I think you'll see a lot of connections between what Daryl had to say. I want to start, though, with this quote that's central to my work as a teacher and as the co-lead of the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project at the Pathstone Foundation. James Baldwin writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I want to invite you to join me as I share for the next couple minutes the way folks of color have faced these issues head on in our community, and the way we're going to have to come together and follow that legacy to continue that legacy to face these issues and create the equity we want to see today in health. I want to start with Howard Coles. He was the editor of the Frederick Douglass Voice newspaper on Clarissa Street, redlined Third Ward neighborhood. And in his paper, he advocated for health equity. He fought back against the health insurance piece that you talked about in the beginning, Dr. Dykes, by having Black-owned health insurance in Rochester. But he also did a housing study that showed awful housing and unsanitary conditions. He found that the banks and real estate agents would only allow Black folks to live in just two neighborhoods of Rochester, the 3rd and the 7th wards, and realized this was coming from the federal government. He found in these two neighborhoods where the majority of all African Americans lived at the time, because they didn't have a choice, over 30% of homes or apartments did not have running water. And in some places like Portland Avenue, 50% didn't have heat. People like Anthony Jordan built on this research, the second Black doctor in Rochester, and challenged it, calling it out right in the DNC in 1942, saying poor housing was the direct cause of the health disparity that we saw back then. And see if you can see any connections between COVID-19 today. Jordan writes, in Rochester, the death rate from all causes is 50% higher than that of whites. The TB death rate among people of color in Rochester is 2.5 times that of whites. And I know Wade shared some of that with the current issues with COVID-19. The Reverend Body at Mount Olivet, almost 10 years later, continued speaking out against these awful conditions, saying in Rochester, only 2 areas have been gracefully made available for him. And if any attempt is made to move out of these Black ghettos, the attempt is met with opposition. And I want to look at the most important piece of opposition. It was something called the National Housing Act of 1934. It built Monroe County suburbs, and it segregated Rochester's inner city, and is largely responsible for many of the health inequities we see, and that excellent map that Dr. Norwood showed us right there at the beginning. This is FDR from New York State, who passed this law. It creates the 30-year mortgage, over $119 billion in federal subsidies, benefiting over 35 million white families like mine, allowing them to purchase a home, or builders to subsidize the construction of suburban developments. It also directed for where people were allowed to live. Written right into the underwriting manual for this law, it explicitly said a neighborhood that if it's stable, the properties must be occupied by the same social and racial classes. going on to mandate racial covenants be written into the deeds if a builder is to receive any kind of federal subsidy for purchasing materials up front, mandating that protective barriers like high-speed traffic arteries be put into place in order to get federal funds for building traffic. So the way we got 490 in the inner loop was in part because it satisfied what the federal government wanted and segregated those red line neighborhoods, the 7th and 3rd wards. So the way this redlining played out from the National Housing Act, redlining was the way they enforced it. Real estate agents were hired by the FHA through HOLC to assess neighborhoods. Green and blue meaning best, 100% white, middle to upper middle class, yellow declining, red hazardous. If even 1% of the neighborhood was African American, it was deemed hazardous, an area where people of color would be steered, and a place where no investment, both federal and local, would be allowed. Take a look at Cornhill, that 3rd ward neighborhood, 75% Black, 10% foreign, therefore, right from the assessor's report, given a red line rating. Compare that to Pittsford's East Avenue Estates, 0% Black, 0% foreign families, therefore blue lined, and if you're white, you can get a 30-year mortgage to live there with very little down. Take a look at my neighborhood, Beechwood, 2% Black at the time, therefore hazardous, compared to Meadowbrook, built by Kodak for whites only, best, green, 0% Black, 0% foreign. Meanwhile, all of our suburbs in Monroe County were green lined. And to show you some of the scope and scale of the way this played out, in 1960, Henrietta was the most diverse suburb of Rochester with only 11 individual people of color, led by the Cooper family and later the Lees and the Wells and many others who joined together with the support of the NAACP to move there in solidarity. The FHA and VA during this time insured half of all new mortgages nationwide, giving out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance. 35 million families like mine benefiting from these FHA and VA-backed loans, and 98% of whom were white. Meanwhile, the real estate industry was participating. Before this happened, they advocated to get codified into these redlining laws, but up until the mid-1950s, a real estate agent nationally and right here in Rochester had to adhere to this code of ethics that said a realtor should never show a Black person a home in a white neighborhood, or else you'll lose your license. Frank Drum, the man on the bottom, was the head of what was the Rochester Real Estate Board, and he enforced this. Howard Coles, who you met in the beginning, got his real estate license, tried to show people of color homes in the all-white 19th Ward. Drum and his friends forced him out of the real estate industry for breaking this code of ethics and kept a really tight fist on how this happened. Another example is a good friend of mine, Dr. Alice Holloway Young. She later became the first Black principal at RCSD, helped found Monroe Community College. And her husband, a upper middle class family, they wanted to move to the 19th Ward. But no real estate agent in town would show them a home. No bank would pre-approve them for a mortgage. So they reached out to a wealthy white friend who bought them the house and sold it to them under the table. And then when they moved in, they faced incredible abuse and racial terror. The Ku Klux Klan was big in Rochester at the time, and they had a death threat threatening to burn their house down that she recorded in the DNC with some pretty horrific language. She shared with me that she asked that when I share her story, I mentioned the Bushes. They were the one white family on the street that stood with them as they faced the racial terror in the 19th Ward. We don't think of our community, though, as a Klan town, but Rochester was. This is the DNC in 1926, 8,000 Klansmen, and what is today the football field at East Rochester High School, burning 3 50-foot-high crosses. The last area I want to focus on before I look a little more at health are racial restrictive covenants. This summer, I was part of writing a report with City Roots and the Yale Law School about these deed restrictions, essentially legally mandating racial restriction or segregation into the deed of a home. And there were thousands of these in Rochester, and the Rochester Bar Association played a critical role in helping these spread to what we found so far is over 10,000 homes in our community. Early F. Case was the president of the Rochester Bar Association, and he and his firm put hundreds of these racial covenants barring anyone not of the Caucasian race from living in those homes. County Manager Smith and the entire legislature signed this into law in Monroe County, putting on all tax foreclosed homes during this period of time explicit de jure segregation from the highest government in the county. Kodak did the same thing with their Meadowbrook neighborhood in Brighton, over 300 homes. ESL Bank was founded to finance these all-white homes that said no dwelling should ever be occupied or sold to a Black person. The Catholic Church with Bishop John Francis O'Hearn put these racial covenants under churches like St. James, barring these churches from ever being used by Black folks. School districts like Thomas Edison and Number 4 in Gates, the DNC advertised these in their paper, encouraging people to not buy a home unless it had them. The head of the Builders Association, Norman Huck, put these on hundreds of homes along with Frank Drum. You can see this here in Irondequoit. Walter Wegman of Wegman's Food Markets, which is no longer in the city of Rochester, except for in the Green-lined East Avenue neighborhood. He had these racial covenants on his house that he agreed to and made sure stayed on when he sold it. But of course, people of color faced them and they fought back. Meet Judge Reuben Davis, who tried to buy a house in the 19th Ward in 1958 on Elmdorf Avenue. He says, the owner refused to sell to us because we were Black, and there was a restrictive covenant in the deed that these houses, when built, were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians. A note, Italians and Jewish folks became legally white around 1944 with a GI Bill, whereas people of color did not have that same access to full citizenship and were continued to be subject to these covenants when Italians and Jewish folks were not. Davis goes on to say in his oral history that he was active in the NAACP, and a white friend bought the house to him and transferred to him, describing it as a devious method just to find housing, and saying what happened to him was typical across our county. And here's where we found some of these so far. And I really encourage you to take a look at the report and examine to see if it's in your neighborhood. Finally, segregation wasn't just limited to housing, it was limited to our hospitals, especially at Strong, where Dean Whipple, whose name recently came down because of student activism after learning some of these things, he actually barred African Americans from entering the medical school, saying that they couldn't enter because they would have to examine white women during their obstetric rounds, and that just wouldn't be allowable. He was proud of this. I mean, he publicly spoke about it when the governor called him to this commission. And it wasn't until the NAACP continued to fight and then eventually started to sue that they were going to lose their tax exemption at U of R. So he had to allow one Black student in each year. Dr. Edwin Robinson was the first. Strong at the time also had a segregated nursery up until the 1960s, which I think Dr. Dykes' presentation illuminated how that kind of could have happened. And this was actually in the Rochester Journal of Medicine, but Dr. Cooper and his wife, Helen, experienced this firsthand. In 1953, when Helen gave birth, Dr. Cooper arrived to find her in a separate and unequal ward of Strong Hospital and vowed never to return to Strong Hospital after that experience. Dr. Lunsford was one of the doctors who fought hard against the segregated policies at Strong and eventually was successful with some of these fights. Meet Edwin Robinson, who was that first student and whose legacy is incredible. He mentored and counseled the few other Black students who came through, like Dr. Robert Rivers and others who've made a huge difference in our community. It was that mentorship that he brought and his pioneering that led to huge changes. And yet still, because of his skin color, Whipple didn't allow him to do his obstetric rounds. He had to finish them somewhere else. And so just this little piece of the story that I'm trying to tell, I think is really crucial that we tell it to lawyers like yourselves, but to students all across the county. And me and my team at the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project at the Pastone Foundation have been working hard, and we've developed curriculum at multiple grade levels and a training where we've trained hundreds of teachers on how to tell this story in much more depth through inquiry to help kids understand this and be empowered by the examples of those like Dr. Robinson and Lunsford to fight back against folks like Early Case the way Judge Davis did and make a true difference in our community. And so to move forward, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I look forward to hearing from Melanie about what she's going to share about that. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Shane. Just an amazing historical outlook on bringing it right home here in Rochester as far as what was going on and what's still going on and the effects of those. And speaking to the effects, our next speaker, Melanie Funchess, is the CEO and principal of Ubuntu Village Works LLC in Rochester, New York. Melanie?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. So first I want to say that how amazed I am at my other presenters and how they have painted the picture, both through law and through practice, of how racism has affected our country and our community. What I'm going to do in my time is talk about the human toll. and how it has affected the mental health of a people. So what we talk about trauma, a lot of times people will talk about fires and earthquakes and floods. But historical trauma is a trauma that occurs to a specific group of people, and it carries on. What we want people to understand is that a lot of times you'll hear people when they're talking about the period of enslavement of Black people, they'll say, "Get over it," or they'll talk about Jim Crow, and they say, "Well, that was so long ago." But when we're going to talk about today is that while these things may have happened, and understand it was not that long ago, that the scars will remain. What I want to talk about quickly is epigenetics. This is an emerging practice in medicine that talks about the enduring effects of things in your body. So, with the pictures you see, the first picture of the first character smoking, this, let's say this is a grandmother. When your grandmother was pregnant with your mother had all of the eggs that she was going to have that would produce you already in her womb when she was in her mother's womb. So what they're showing here with smoking is if your grandmother smoked, the effects of that not only went to your mother but went to you. So when your mother, the next slide with the red, the next slide when your mother is pregnant with you, if you're born girl, if you're whatever you have, the DNA signature to you is already there when you're in the womb. So you got what you got from your grandmother, your mother gets things, and your children will get from their grandmother, and here comes you. So, like I said, a woman who smokes while pregnant induces an epigenetic changes for 3 generations. Once herself, her unborn daughter, and her daughter's reproductive cells, right? But now we're talking about this in smoking. But this also happens with trauma. So now, if we're going back and thinking about the uh, the years of trauma of enslavement, how many generations of passed on um, trauma? How will that affect us? So, taking that in mind, I want to take us on a journey from 1619 to 1865 was 246 years of chattel slavery. Now, think about how many generations that endured the Middle Passage, that endured the horrors that we know today from enslavement. And if we're saying that these things are passed on generation to generation and they are cumulative, what has happened in those 246 years? But then we're going to go for another 100 years from 1865 to 1965. And I'd be willing to bet that there's someone who's listening under the sound of my voice that was born maybe in 1965 or before. That was Jim Crow. It's 100-year period after emancipation where there were no rights. Both of the speakers before me talked about what happened in that time and how it would affect us, right? Now, we say 1965, Civil Rights Act, we're here. The struggle continues to this day to full inclusion. We still see healthcare disparities today. We still see how the effects of a 402-year journey struggling to be seen as human, to be seen as a full citizen, being so that my daughter does not get tased at 9 years old, so that my brother does not die naked in the snow in March on a snowy night. 402 years. Now, I've laid out the time, I've laid out the effects, but now I want to share with you some of the things that happened. J. Marion Sims is known as the father of modern gynecology. And there was a statue of him in New York City that was just recently removed. What people talk about was J. Marion Sims innovated the speculum and did a lot of things that people that have evolved in today's practices. But what people don't talk about is that he practiced on enslaved Black women. And because of his belief that Black women didn't feel pain, he performed gynecological procedures on Black women without anesthesia, had them held down and tied down, but said they did not feel pain, that we did not have the intellectual capacity to feel pain. Yet a statue was erected to this man that stood in Central Park until the last 18 months. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm talking about medical things, but I'm also talking about things that are not medical in their nature because they all follow the same track. So we have J. Marion Sims, who performed procedures on Black women because he felt that white women were too delicate to do these such things. So we're going to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Recently, Tulsa has come into the news because it was the 100th anniversary of the massacre on Black Wall Street. And they, people have called it the Tulsa race riot. It was not a riot. It was a massacre. Tulsa, Oklahoma had a section of town that had Black shops. There was Black hospitals and stores and libraries and schools and everything that you'd have a need in a town. White people became enraged that Black people lived and operated for themselves, even though segregation was the law of the land. And they came and they burned down Black Wall Street, and people died. And people want to know why Black people are not trusting. The same thing happened in Rosewood, a whole nother community where people were run out of town. A whole town was burned down based on a lie. Based on a lie. And in the published, what's the word I want to use? Official report, the death toll was either between 2 and 6. But the other report said the death toll was upwards of 125 people. Moving forward in history, now all of this is in the 20th century. Okay, let's be clear. All of this happened in the 20th century. Between 1938 and 1966, 5,000 Black women were forcibly sterilized, robbed of their ability to produce children. 5,000 women. That's what they know of through forced sterilization. Now, one woman that people may have heard of whose ability was procreate was stolen from them is Fannie Lou Heyman. Her famous like, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Do you looking at this history now? I'm not even all the way done, but we've been up until this point. We have been experimented upon, burnt out of entire towns, forced to run, and then under the thing of eugenics to try and stop us from being sterilization of our women. Then we'll move on to Tuskegee. The Tuskegee experiment here, and when we're talking about COVID today, a lot of people, they'll say, well, Black people remember Tuskegee, right? The Tuskegee experiment was a syphilis experiment where doctors wanted to see what the end syphilis looked like at the end stages. So they were men who had syphilis, and even though they knew it came out that penicillin was a viable treatment, they withheld treatment from these men and made it so they could not get treatment anywhere, so they could watch the progression of this disease. For decades, this went on. Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks was a woman. She had cancer. Without her knowledge, without her consent, they withdrew her cells. And they figured out her cells didn't die. They're called HeLa cells. HE for Henrietta, LA for Lacks. A vast majority of the innovations that we saw from that time and forward came from HeLa cells. Yet her family did not know that this was done to their mom, to their wife, to their auntie, to their relative. And this family, even though pharmaceutical companies and hospitals now have made millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of dollars, this family lived in poverty and lives in poverty. I'm saying all these things to start to paint a picture. As we're moving into, a lot of times I talk about COVID-19 meets racism 2020 or racism 2021. When we want to figure out why, they said Black people, there's a hesitancy around taking the vaccine. There's a hesitancy. We've heard about the racial disparities in healthcare. We've heard about what has happened. We see this history. Is there any wonder why Black people are hesitant to engage in systems? Women had their wombs taken from them without their consent. They were studied and thought that they didn't feel pain. And understand, the idea that Black people feel less pain is something that endures until this day. It is a pervasive notion that endures until this day. People were denied treatment so that people could see how they would die. Because that's what it was. Don't get it. There was to see how people would die. But we want to know we want to know how this affects people. If you know that this is your history when engaging with systems, if you know that you cannot buy homes because of redlining, if you know that you can't get mortgages, if you know that you can't get jobs, if you know that you can't go to schools, if you know these things, and this is what you carry, and remember, it goes from generation to generation to generation. We want to understand how we are and why we are hesitant. It's not because I've been hearing in the COVID discussions that people say, we got to dispel the myths. None of this is a myth. These things actually happen. And the thing about these things actually happening, by and large, there has been no recompense for these things. There has been no true walk up to and reparation for these atrocities. And I gave a smattering for the purposes of our talk today. If this is our history on this soil, why would we as a people trust any system for anything? And so I'm not going to leave you without any hope. But people say, well, in the midst of all that, how do we heal? I talk about 3 R's: remember, reflect, and return. Despite all that I have said, Black people in this country, back to our African roots, come from a rich history. They did not take slaves off the shores of Africa across the Middle Passage. They took doctors, they took scientists, they took farmers, they took craftsmen and artisans, and enslaved them. And it's about us being remembered to that lineage and that heritage, to reflect on, despite everything that's been done and everything that's happened, how our people have endured. And understanding there were specific things that helped us to endure, helped us to find joy, helped us to come and overcome. And let us return and cling and hold to those things. The symbol Umoja is for unity. And for us as Black people to stand united in the uplifting of our people. I wanted to take this time and just to offer you a little look back into when you're asking, why don't people trust? There's a reason. And I just offered you a snippet of why the reason is. And I will be happy to take questions during our question and answer portion. That's all that I have.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm quite sure we're gonna revisit epigenetics in the Q&A. So look forward to discussing that in further detail. Right now, just take a brief break to read out the code. Once again, this is the code for those that are seeking CLE credits. The first code is 3437. That's 3437. All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Mahala Schlagman, who is an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Rochester Medical Center Division of General Medicine and is director of the Health Equity Curriculum for Internal Medicine residents at URMC. I'm sorry, doctor, can't hear you. Are you on mute?
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
And thank you to all of our previous speakers. It's really an honor to be here tonight with all of these incredibly brilliant thinkers. So as Duwaine mentioned, my name is Mahala Schlagman. I run the health equity curriculum for our internal medicine residents at the University of Rochester. And internal medicine, if you're not familiar with our language, is really doctors who see adults. So if you come into the hospital, you have a urinary tract infection, you have a heart attack, you're an adult, you probably are seeing one of us at the University of Rochester, at Strong, or at Highland. That's our team. And I want to talk about one of the things that we talk about all the time, which is the social determinants of health in our curriculum. So when I think about health outcomes, I think a lot about what Wade referenced, which is upstream concepts and downstream concepts. So I live what I would call downstream in terms of the social determinants of health. I see patients in a primary care office. My residents see patients in the hospital, and we really see the long-term consequences of illness and of health inequity, and we see it every day. Upstream, as Wade mentioned, is really the determinants that have impacted people for their whole lives and contribute to them coming to us at the end with significant burden of disease, where some of our patients who live in the city, for example, have an average length of life that is 10 years lower than those who are living in affluent suburbs, or some of our patients who are living in rural areas have an average life expectancy that is lower than those living in affluent suburbs. And just to give you a flavor of some of the suffering that we see on a daily basis, I'm going to share a poem that was written by actually one of the therapists who's in our office. So the poem is called Complicated Grief, Complicated Goodbyes. Tear-stained cigarettes on our Zoom calls, crouched in the doorway, spotty service, but a private space near an outlet. She's plugged in, but cannot recharge, depleted. She lights another one, breaking her gaze. Stillborn, she sobs. Later, she cries, her cries echo during her mother's final days. A grandchild she'll never meet, a parent without a goodbye. And when Melanie Funchess references some of the ongoing trauma that we are suffering, we are seeing actively each day, that trauma has not ended by any stretch of the imagination, as you have seen from all of the information about regulatory and the historical environment. That trauma is ongoing. And I have patients, particularly within our communities of color, who have lost 10 family members during COVID. Just incredible and unbelievable suffering. And this particular patient, she is trying her best to utilize the health system with a therapist. And yet it's so difficult for her to overcome some of the experiences that she has had because of their incredible suffering and sorrow. One of the things that she uses to cope, which is mentioned in this poem, is cigarettes. And we see this all the time, that when our patients are suffering, a lot of times the answer that they come to might be cigarettes, or might be some other choice that alleviates their suffering in the moment. And yet over the very long term actually makes them sicker, and ultimately can lead to early death. So this is just a snapshot of some of the suffering that we see. The thing that is a bit lovely about sharing this poem is that this patient at least had easy access to speak to someone who she could share with outside of this traumatic experience, which she helped develop a collaborative relationship with. And in connection with the support she received from her family, has helped this particular person to work within her grief and begin moving on from her suffering. The thing that we do at Strong Internal Medicine is we actually have multidisciplinary partnership. And we are a very small part of a very large system. But I want to talk about some of the very small things that we do that can potentially help, I think, within this incredibly vast and challenging experience that people are having. So the therapist in our office is actually part of a model called integrated behavioral health, where we actually have therapists and also a psychiatrist on service. And before that, we would often have to send patients away to other locations in order to be able to serve them. And we were not able to often connect with the therapists at all. And we weren't really able to build a team to support people who had mental health needs, and especially severe mental health needs. And we have seen really actual progress for some of our patients because we're able to immediately deal with some of the suffering that they experience, rather than have them experience significant delays to get care. So that's a partnership within the medical system, a partnership that is downstream, so to speak. But I want to talk about something that has the potential to work upstream. And that concept is medical legal partnership. So medical legal partnership, this is the logo for our medical legal partnership that is really a small representation of an idea that's going on nationally. Medical legal partnership actually exists in 49 states, and it also exists at over 240 institutions. And what it does is it brings free civil legal services into offices, primary care offices, and hospitals, and sometimes other offices as well, in order to address some of the social determinants of health upstream from the challenges that we have in the hospital and in our offices. So for example, a patient who we have had significant mental health needs. And unfortunately, she was going to be illegally evicted from her housing because she was causing basically a disruption. And one of the things that we were really able to do, and really it was our legal partners who were able to do it, was to convince, in legal terms, the landlord that they should keep her in her housing. Now, maybe that's something that you might think is not that big a deal, to keep somebody in housing, but let me tell you, that was the ticket to her survival. If she had gone to become someone who was homeless, we would have likely seen really dramatic fall off in our ability to care for her. And we were able to build a team around her, offer her supports in her environment, and continue caring for her in a consistent way, which we otherwise in no way would be able to do if she had lost her housing. And so by answering this upstream problem of housing, we ultimately impacted her life, and she remains in that same apartment, which is pretty exceptional. Medical legal partnership is something that we've had now in our office. We had a pilot for 1.5 years, and we are now in our second round of funding. In the first year, we saw issues that were pretty comparable to nationally identified issues. So we saw 129 patients from my office at Strong Internal Medicine. The partnership that we have also is at a different practice at Highland. And primarily, we're seeing a lot of benefits issues, housing, and family law, with the other smattering that you see in the back corner on the left. Of note, our partnership does not address immigration law due to the restrictions on the work that our partner organization, Law New York, has. But we are able to really address a broad swath of issues that our physicians otherwise really could not address on their own. And we are in the process of having conversations with or working up to have conversations more with the clients that we serve. But we were able to survey our residents and clinicians after the first year. And we really found that all of the social workers found that this was sort of the best thing since sliced bread, because the issues that they otherwise really would get stuck with, that they didn't know what to do with, they finally could give teeth to the issue. In addition, on average, our clinicians found medical legal partnership to be incredibly helpful and really helped us to actually address the social needs that our patients had. And medical legal partnership, more fundamentally, is really, I think, the beginnings for us of an opportunity to start to address things like public policy and the rule of law, just like Wade mentioned. Because right now we're addressing one person at a time, but other medical legal partnerships have been able to influence the institutions that they've been a part of by capitalizing on looking at multiple different patient experiences and then giving that feedback to the institution that they were partnering with. And ultimately, medical legal partnership has also gone on in some states to address public policy that could potentially change the underlying factors that are influencing the social determinants of health. So when I think about social determinants, I really think that, you know, our patients are under this tremendous pressure right now between the many pandemics that they are suffering from. And we as primary care doctors are with them in many ways at the end point. Many times at the very end of their lives is where we're really getting to see and experience them. But if we have the potential as patients, as clients, as clinicians, to go and jump to start to begin to address other health factors and policies and programs, that is a unique opportunity that I'm hopeful can have some influence in our community. And more than that, I think that having partnership with our community will really have the opportunity to influence our institution, bringing in the community, allowing the institution to hear from the community and identify the needs of the community. And in addition to not just that, but expand our partnership with other community organizations is a way to come together and work together to improve our current health disparities. Now, this is a 400-year problem that we're addressing. And so I often tell my patients who have chronic pain, unfortunately, as long as it took you to get this pain, that's how long it's going to take to unwind it. And I hope that that is not true with health disparities. But I also prepare for that possibility. Nonetheless, I'm hopeful. I see exceptional change, even at our institutional level. Things that seemed so unbelievable, impossible. Suddenly there's movement. And I am excited to be a part of this opportunity at this time. And as terrible as this opportunity is, I think that it is incumbent upon us to take this knowledge, this revelation almost, of the real and traumatic suffering that has been experienced in the Black community and in other communities of color and in communities experiencing poverty, and use that to contribute to our community. And if perhaps you might think, as I have often thought, well, I'm just one person, what can I do? There are so many opportunities to join together in our community. There are so many volunteer opportunities to speak out. And I would encourage everyone to take the knowledge that they have, to learn more, and to be a part of that voice for change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, I think I speak for everyone on this particular Zoom. Our panel is exceptional. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to take a very brief 5-minute break. It is 7 o'clock right now. We're going to reconvene at 7:05. We have several different questions that we're going to put to the panel. And please feel free during the break if you would like to submit any additional questions to do so at this point in time. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We have somewhat of a limited time frame in order to get through some of these questions. So if the panel is ready to go, please let me know. All right. Once again, thank you all for participating in this. It's been a truly remarkable and enlightening conversation. First question, and this one goes to Dr. Dykes. With the Hill-Burton Act committing roughly 36 million to 89 facilities, of which only 4 million of those went to African American facilities. What is your comment, or what is your stance? What do you say to those that would indicate that we have to have a race neutral or ethnic neutral policy in order to deal with the historic head start of a race non-neutral discrimination?
Yeah, that's a great but tough question, and I think the bottom line is it's important to understand, again, going back to the beginning of my presentation, where we are now has everything to do with structural institutional racism. So there are factors that are baked into our system that have systematically excluded Black and brown people from equitable care and justice in the health sphere. And so to answer your question, I think most directly, the way to mitigate the effects of injustice is to achieve justice. And it sounds fairly simplistic, but one is recognizing the problem, and then secondly, and more importantly, is developing systems that address finally these baked in systemic reasons that Black and brown people continue to suffer injustice in the health sphere. And the bottom line is that will come from policies and practices and legislation that levels the playing field.
And even though these questions might be directed to just one panel, if someone wanted to weigh in on it, please feel free.
Duwaine, if you don't mind, I would love to weigh in, and I would just suggest, as I do at most places I talk, that people think about the curb cut effect. That when Berkeley put in curb cuts, they did it to support those who were wheelchair users or mobility impaired, but it wound up benefiting everyone. There is absolutely everything right with doing something for a particular group when you know that the benefit of addressing that group will benefit everyone. I think we need to be brave enough to be race conscious. I think we need to be brave enough to be race specific, and we need to be brave enough to say that we're doing so because the harm was race specific, race intentional, and continues to this day. And the repeal of Shelby is my proof. As soon as that voting protection was removed, those southern states proceeded to go right back to overt voter suppression.
And along those lines, and this one, I guess, would be for Melanie and Shane specifically, but like I said, please feel free to jump in. When you're dealing with trying to remove the veil, I think you have a lot of pushback in detailing, well, can we just move forward? And I guess, how would you approach that in that people want the reconciliation without the truth? And both of you spoke to the historical aspects of the effects and also the education portion of that detail. And also, if I can just have a second part to that, there was a question in regards to speaking regarding the gentrification of and the inner loop, if you can touch on that as well.
I'm going to defer to Shane about the gentrification question because that's his house. But in terms of wanting just to move forward, there can be no healing without justice. Period. And people want us to heal, and there can be no healing without justice. And the fact of the matter, it's not over. What happened to that little 9-year-old girl on Friday is indicative that it's not over. What happened less than a year ago to Daniel Prude is indicative that it's not over. What is happening to 20,000 Rochester City School District students today is indicative that it's not over. There can be no healing without justice. There's no justice without recompense. So understand and be clear. We can't move past it because we haven't moved through it. Shane?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I recommend reading Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, or looking into some of the work they've been doing in Montgomery with a museum around racial justice. He talks a lot about how we have to tell the truth, but in our country, it's almost like we're allergic to telling the truth about the injustices we've done. Whereas when you go somewhere like Germany, I mean, there's a monument everywhere you go to the millions of Jewish folks who were murdered by the state. And when you look at how a similar thing happened in our country to African Americans, incredible oppression, and yet all along we've never made recompense. Jewish folks still receive reparation from Germany to this day, if those who are in those camps. And I think that, how do we move forward? Not that that's solved the problem with the Jewish community, of course, but just thinking that in our country, we haven't even begun to do that or to tell these stories, which brings me to a story when I think about gentrification. It's really interesting to me that we think about the inner loop. Which part of the inner loop did we fill in first? We filled in the part that's closest to predominantly white neighborhoods, predominantly by Strong Museum of Play, a place where I was a member as a child and drove in from Webster to go and play, 3 days a week, and played with majority white children while I was there, right? But then I think about, wait, where is Strong Museum located? It's located on Savannah Street, which was part of the Southeastern Inner Loop Project and Urban Renewal Project. Over $35 million by the federal government was given to our community, an all-white panel led by Elmer Milliman and John Dale, Central Trust in the city. They collaborated. They didn't allow people like Howard Coles on it, and they displaced hundreds and hundreds of families, over 886 families from the 7th Ward, 850 from the 3rd. And in that Savannah Street neighborhood, a predominantly Black mixed neighborhood, over 250 families were displaced. And on that ground today stands Strong Museum. What should have been there, and what according to the urban renewal plans was supposed to be there, was a massive amount of affordable housing to replace the displacement that happened to families like my friend Mary Kearney, a teacher at Rochester City School District, who, when she was 10 years old, her family came up to Rochester. They had an amazing community on Savannah Street in spite of the redlining, in spite of the inequality. Again, that was a redlined area of the city. And I mean, they didn't lock their doors. Her cousins and uncles lived down the street. They'd, go there after school. There was childcare. There was the village taking care of people. And then urban renewal comes through, right? And destroys this neighborhood. Just one of the places. We could talk about Clarissa or so many of these other places, but it destroys that fabric that directly affects your health. Your community affects your mental health. And we haven't talked about that. That's not a part of our story when we talk about a place like Strong Museum. It's my hope there wouldn't be a kid in our community that wouldn't learn in school about the redlining, about the urban renewal, about the places where they play and where they live, and at whose expense. Instead of affordable housing, it was a vacant lot for 10 years in that place. And then the Strong people snapped it up for a penny because the urban renewal place went bankrupt because of some dirty dealings, and it just, it builds and it builds. And so one of the actions for the person in the chat who asked, how can we get involved with these actions? I would get involved. The United Way offers great things, but I'd also look at who are the groups of activists who are doing this work. And I look at the Black Agenda Group doing amazing things. City Roots Community Land Trust is fighting actively against gentrification in Beechwood and in the Plymouth Exchange neighborhood. The Rochester Housing Justice Alliance and Tenant Union is fighting against the almost 9,000 evictions we have in our community a year. Thinking about some of those sort of things and how we can get involved, as well as going to your school boards and saying, I want my children to learn this history. I want them to see people like Howard Coles and Alice Young who fought back and carry on that legacy. And I want them to know about how our family didn't do anything for those white folks. We were complicit, we let it happen, and we're still letting it happen, but we're not going to anymore.
I think also it's an issue really of trust. When I see patients and we don't understand what they have experienced, I think it's our failure as medical providers. And until we understand why there might be a lack of trust, we will continue to fail at having a real discussion surrounding care with those who have great reason to be fearful of systems outside their own communities.
And you mentioned something, Doctor, as far as trust is concerned. And I wanted you to touch a little bit on this. I know Melanie touched on it before, dealing with epigenetics, but also the notion of our community not being one that feels pain, and how that comes through in treatment. There was a story a few years back in regards to, the tennis player, Serena, when she gave birth, and she had to be her own self-advocate while they were just passing her off as complaining and things of that nature. And her story is not unique. No. So can you speak to the perception? And then after that, Wade, you said something during your presentation regarding perception versus reality, as far as how people see themselves and trying to get them to understand that. So after Doctor, you speak, Wade, can you address that as well?
Yeah, so unfortunately, racism is really baked into medical training. In a very serious way that I think many of us in the medical community had not been educated in any way whatsoever about that. And I can appreciate that there are a whole bunch of reasons why that is, but there's a certain reckoning that's happening nationally in a way that's pretty exciting, with an actual thought process behind why we may have had really effectively segregation in how we think about care for Black Americans. There's all sorts of examples of really racist ideology baked into medicine, and the idea that Black people do not experience pain in the same way is just one more of them. And unfortunately, if you pull medical providers, and I fortunately don't have the numbers off the top of my head, there are still quite a few clinicians who think that Black people do not experience pain in the same way. And I also think that those of us who know consciously that that is not true probably, unfortunately, also have an unconscious bias in that way, which we need to be able to work to actively overcome on a minute-to-minute basis, or we will really fail some of our Black patients in a big way. And that is a real tragedy. There are many different examples. Just the way that kidney function is calculated, for example, for Black people, it makes it such that effectively Black Americans are prioritized lower on transplant lists than white Americans. They can't get onto the transplant list until they're, you can't get onto the transplant list until your kidney function meets a certain threshold. But it's calculated in such a way in Black Americans where the actual GFR, or the number that is calculated, your kidney function is lower based on being white as opposed to Black. And that's just explicitly, basically, racism baked into kidney function. And there's so many other examples of practices that we need to actively work to undo. And there finally is a literature that's coming out rather rapidly in a lot of major medical journals surrounding a discussion of sort of an awakening of how this has been baked in. But there is so much more education to do. And really, we need the historical background in order to be able to begin to understand how these things have been baked in, where they've been baked in, and why. Otherwise, we will fail to uncover them, and we will fail to address issues of trust with our patients as well.
I just wanted to add to this is that we're seeing the change in the mental health world. The American Psychiatric Association just last week issued an apology to communities of color for their outward promotion of white supremacy and disparate treatment in psychiatry. Now, this comes right after they just had their first African American president, Dr. Alpha Stewart. So it's one step, but I just wanted to acknowledge it that things are moving. But the thing is, it takes we're a million steps from home, so we have to keep going.
And I would, in response, Duwaine, just chime in on my colleagues to say that it is why I eagerly accepted the invitation to be here, because this requires courageous conversations. And I really salute the local bar community for holding this conversation, because Shane is devoting his time and his colleagues to dealing with the fundamental ignorance that we have as a society about our own history. Anyone looking for a book to read, I recommend Eric Foner, Foner, The Second Founding, the history of what was happening during the Reconstruction era, a history that is well known among the community of African Americans, but not really known by broader American. And Mahala's comment of the fact that the medical community is finding the courage to have these conversations as well is extremely important. On Monday coming, the university will join other medical educators across the state in a presentation in front of the Board of Regents, having the conversation about the lack of diversity in the healthcare workforce, because the data is clear. Where the workforce looks like the patient, outcomes are better. Why are we not producing more students who are able to persist through medical school? Part of it has to deal with undergraduate and graduate education, but also part of it is what happens in preschool through 12th grade. This is our challenge, and to directly answer the question, what we have to understand is what we perceive as being the negatively valued behavior of young children, particularly young Black children in our community, is oftentimes their exhibition of their incredible skills at creativity and that gross and fine motor skill. And we tend to look at that as bad behavior. And in fact, we created an educational system and culture that really punished students and that really devalued their own individuality, that culminates in our lived experience of just these past days of a member of the Rochester Police Department screaming at a 9-year-older to stop acting like a child. And that 9-year-older had far more presence of mind to pronounce the reality. I am, she said, a child. When we adults stop adulterating childhood and allow children to be the divine creatures that they are born to be, all children to be the divine creatures they are born to be, then we will know that ours is moving towards being Dr. King's beloved community.
I'm going to jump in again, but speaking of children, if you look, there's a study called the Age of Innocence, where it talks about how Black children are seen as older and more dangerous, frankly. And so when you hear the officer tell the 9-year-old stop acting like a child, and she has to tell him, "I am a child." My question is, how old did he perceive her to be? And how does that work in schools? How does that work in hospitals? How does that work? Because we have to understand these things are pervasive. And what I would say to people, read a book, read a study, read an article.
And along those lines, Dr. Dykes, there was a question in regards to the attempts to try to move towards approving of an intentional racist act instead of disparate impact. And that always seems to be the fallback, in that, well, it wasn't intentional or it's race neutral on its face, but the impact can't be denied. So how did we move forward in the medical field or legally as far as addressing the disparate impact and making sure that's the forefront?
Yeah, sure. So this whole issue that we're discussing is about disparate impact. Again, as I mentioned in my presentation, they exist, but it's probably rare that there are intentional racist or racist policies and procedures on their face. So the whole concept of disparate impact is to deal with policies and procedures that are on their face neutral, but have disparate impact in their effect. And so the Civil Rights Act and other laws and court decisions have addressed this issue. What we know, and as I presented in my presentation, with respect to healthcare, there is no private right of action. There is no private individual has standing to bring legal action regarding disparate impact as it exists in healthcare. If you walk into your doctor's office and there's a sign there that says colored waiting room and white waiting room, well, then I think you've got a case. But on the other hand, the disparate impact that's received by the treatment that you get is not actionable at an individual level. The Department of Health and Human Services Office of Minority Health does have that authority to bring those cases, but again, as I mentioned, it's been rarely used. This has been it's been more prevalent, more common in the housing and education arenas, where people have successfully brought disparate impact cases. But in closing, I guess what I'll say is there was an 11th hour attempt during the last administration to actually further limit disparate impact, powers, basically, and further limit plaintiffs' abilities to bring disparate impact lawsuits with the final rule that was proposed under the Trump administration, again, related to housing discrimination. But that is something that should be and must remain on our radar.
And I know we're going to get ready to wrap up soon, so I'll read the last code for those that are getting CLE credits. It'd be 7403. That's 7403. One of the questions that I really wanted to get to was on the topic of COVID, and it states that one tool that has been used that has been helped to determine as far as hospitalization is the pulse oxygen meter. But it does not read accurately for people of color. So how can this be addressed?
I don't know the answer to that. I wonder if Dr. Schlagman might, but we do have at Common Ground Health a technical advisory committee that has been formed by the Black Physicians Network, and they have been an incredible resource as we have moved through COVID to look at issues like this and make recommendation. And I am absolutely, I've already fired off an email to ask Dr. Linda Clark this very question. And as we learn, I'll happily circle back and share with you all for distribution to the whole team.
Thank you. Yes, I was just doing a little research as we were sitting here. So it's actually, it appears that in about a third of patients of color, you can have a tendency towards inaccurate measurements. So it's not absolute that it's completely wrong for everyone, but for certain individuals on average, it's more likely to be statistically incorrect, particularly when your oxygen is at like a marginal level. So you're right around that like 90% border which is like our criteria for hospitalization. I actually posted a device that seems to actually take this into account. Unfortunately, it's an expensive device, and so that's not a very good answer at all. But there was a New England Journal of Medicine article just in December that really highlighted this issue. And I am hopeful that when things start to get highlighted, that they start to move, especially the New England Journal of Medicine, which a lot of people and pulmonologists follow. I would really readily appreciate Dr. Clark's opinion as well.
You know, I'll just add to that if I can for the portion of the audience that are not healthcare providers and not physicians. This is a really simple thing. So pulse oximetry, and we've all seen this where you put a little device on your fingertip and it's got a light beam that projects through your skin to measure the percentage of oxygen saturation of your blood. And that little red light has different outcomes based upon pigmentation in the skin. It's a no-brainer, right? So if you're darker complexion or darker skin, because of the way the device physically reads the oxygenation of your blood, it's possible that heavily pigmented people have an erroneously low reading. And so when you're talking about interventions for COVID, whether we're going to admit patients to hospitals, put them on ventilators, treat them with certain drugs, if they are reading erroneously high oxygen concentrations based upon this one test, then therein lies another opportunity for inequity.
Yeah, and I can think of patients where I was very nervous about them. They were right at that cutoff. They're patients of color. And because of the strains on the healthcare system, anybody who doesn't quite meet the cutoff, we send home to watch at home. And, if you're not careful and somebody's not following up or somebody doesn't know when they need to come back, there's a lot of risk there.
We are actually out of time, but I wanted to provide you guys with an opportunity to make a final statement, a final call to action, whatever it may be, or let us know where we can see you again, because honestly, you guys have been unbelievable. You guys have been unbelievable, the information that you've provided, and the thought process, the thought provocation that you've given has been absolutely wonderful. There was another question after your final statements. If you would like to stay on and answer that question, by all means, but I want to give you at least an opportunity to do a closing statement. And I guess we could start with Wade.
Thank you very much. I would just close by saying how much I really appreciated the opportunity to be here this evening. And I would note that the first law of health improvement, as promulgated by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, is that all systems are designed to achieve exactly the results that they achieve. And so our dissatisfaction with the results should really lead us to focus on how do we redesign the systems through which people have to experience life so as to achieve health equity.
Dr. Dykes?
Yeah, I would agree. I appreciate the Bar Association bringing this panel together. It's been a wonderful opportunity. And I will put in the chat my email address for people that want to continue the dialogue. I'm happy to do that. It's actually dykesd@upstate.edu, and I'll put that in the chat. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for the opportunity to participate here.
Thank you. Shane?
I say thank you as well for having me. And I hope that the Bar Association and others here examine their own families as well as their organizations, including the bar, for their racist history and pushing forward of racist policies. Remember, Early Case was the head of the Rochester Bar Association, and he put racial covenants on hundreds of homes across our community. I would love to see that statement of apology and a deep dive into some of that history, as well as concrete reparation. To me, eviction court is one of those places where more help for tenants. And there are so many folks right now fighting for this. And that kind of volunteer help could be crucial as one piece of that process to make that difference. And I'll echo what everyone before me is saying, it's got to be about systems change.
Melanie?
I'd like to say thank you to everyone for this opportunity to engage in this dialogue and for people to remember that racism is a public health crisis.
Yes.
And that there is something that you can do from your sphere of control, your sphere of influence, and your sphere of concern. Have those uncomfortable holiday discussions, do what you have to do, read your books, and challenge people who look like you.
Dr. Schlagman?
I would add also that as you challenge your own beliefs and are considering how to make change, ideas that you have may never have been thought of by the medical community. And that's the profound challenge, perhaps, of our generation. The reality that we are stuck in our own towers of knowledge. And if you have ideas, thinking about how do we triage people in the emergency department differently, these are exceptional questions that we need to be asking, that because of my place, I may not have necessarily thought of, because I'm so baked into the system myself. It's hard to get that perspective. And so I would ask that if, for example, Common Ground House sends you a survey and says, can you please tell us about your experience? Please share, because that sharing, that opportunity for us to hear from you, sometimes we even call it research, which I know can be a scary term for a lot of people in the Black community. But if you would consider participating and sharing your opinion, that it has a tremendous opportunity to have effect on us, and we would greatly appreciate it. And I'm happy to share my email address as well. Definitely would love to hear ideas that we can incorporate into our community.
All right. On behalf of the bar, I want to thank you guys once again for dedicating your time to this panel discussion. It was enlightening. It was disturbing, which is probably even better. And I guess COVID really unearthed, to some people's eyes, something that was really sinister for a very long time. And one of the things that we do these panel discussions in order to draw attention to, but not only shine a light on it, but also do a call to action. So for those that attended, if you are interested, please reach out to our panelists. They are more than well versed in what they discussed today. And if you are looking to educate yourself on doing things moving forward, I implore you to get involved, get involved. Martin Luther King Jr.'s last book was Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? And that is still the same question that we are asking right now. So once again, thank you.
Thank you.